So I was enjoying the sight of this X from out there, but now I've realized that it's obscuring half the audience. I hadn't appreciated that before. Maybe no, okay, I'm going to have to use... Can you all hear me? All right, I'll stand out here. All right, then. Thank you all for coming. In particular, thank you all for getting back from lunch in time for this talk. This is what I'm going to talk about. There is a slight connection. Well, I've got a microphone. Is it going to work? Okay. Now I have the disadvantage of having three things to hold, but unfortunately regenerative medicine has not reached the point of giving me three hands. So, okay. Right. So you heard before lunch about the wonderful work showing how memory is so, counterintuitive really, how the recalling of a memory can, in principle, actually diminish the intensity of that memory, even when we know that our normal experience is that the opposite thing happens. And this actually is a topic that comes up quite often in conversations I have about aging. People worry about the question of whether our brains will fill up if we live incredibly long. And, of course, the reason they don't is because when we don't recall a memory, it gradually becomes less and less distinct, and eventually we forget things completely. In the same way that I bet half of you can't remember half the names of the people that you were at school with when you were age 6 or whatever. And that's sort of okay, because the things that we don't remember are the things that we have not recalled, and therefore the things that don't really matter to us very much. So it's a fascinating topic to discover how this all works. And I was aware of Kamal's work when it came out 10 or 12 years ago, and I was delighted to be able to hear an update on it, which actually perhaps I should have already kept up with. But anyway, to get onto the topic that I work on, which is aging, I'm interested in bringing aging under really comprehensive medical control. And this is something that it's always been obvious to me is, first of all, feasible in principle, and second of all, extremely desirable. And yet, I didn't actually work on it until I reached the age of 30 or so. Why would that be? The answer is very simple. It just hadn't occurred to me that anyone else could possibly take an alternative view, that anyone else could possibly think that aging was either desirable or inevitable. And so I actually had to marry and learn a great deal from a biologist in order to discover that this wasn't the case, and that most biologists regard aging as not very interesting and not very important, in order to decide that actually the entire world is crazy and I have to actually switch fields from computer science, which is what I used to do, and work on aging instead. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the foundation that's been created around my work, SENS Foundation, does, and what the likely, as we take it anyway, outcome of our work will be. First of all, why is aging such a problem? How big a problem is aging? This is something that a lot of people have a mistaken impression about, because a lot of people think of death from aging as being the thing that you'd like to happen to you, as being death from causes that are distinct from the diseases of old age that we definitely don't want to get. Death from natural causes, as opposed to having Alzheimer's disease or cancer or cardiovascular disease and so on. But that's nonsense. Think about it for a moment. How could any disease of aging be a disease of aging? Surely a disease that just is independent of aging would be independent in terms of its distribution. It would affect young adults just as often as it affects older adults. The only way a disease can predominantly afflict people who were born a long time ago is if it is some aspect of the later stages of a process that goes on throughout life but is initially harmless, initially does not cause disease. Right? So that means that in order to talk about who dies from aging, you actually have to include all of those diseases. Anything that mainly kills older people. And these are the numbers you get when you do that. Out of this number here, 150,000, which is how many people die each day worldwide from all causes added together, 2/3 of them die from aging. And of course, in those parts of the world where we don't often die of malaria and such like, it's a much higher proportion than that. Plus also, hey, come on, what part of this is it hard to understand? It's not much fun dying of natural causes either. This person probably doesn't have any of the diseases of old age. She'll be getting slightly demented. But the fact is, you'd probably prefer to be this guy up here, even if he is about to have his head bitten off by a shark, right? So this is what we do. SENS Foundation, this is what passes for our mission statement. We're a charity. We're based over here in California, to be precise. And we are interested in developing regenerative medicine against aging. So I'm going to be explaining what that means and why it's such an interesting idea. And the first thing I'm going to do is to define a couple of terms. You probably think you know what both of these things mean, but I'm going to be a bit more careful. I'm going to make sure that we're on the same page. First of all, regenerative medicine. Regenerative medicine includes things like stem cell therapy and tissue engineering, which are pretty high profile in the media these days. I'm sure that even those of you who are not biologists have heard of these things and understand broadly what they are. They're involving like replacing organs with artificial organs or repairing organs using cells. But there's more to regenerative medicine than that. A definition of regenerative medicine that works is right here. This involves every aspect of restoring function to the body by restoring its structure, whether it's a particular organ or the whole body, and whether the damage that was done that you need to restore the function of is an acute injury like spinal cord trauma, or whether it's chronic, gradually accumulating damage like aging. And furthermore, this definition doesn't take any particular position on what sort of restoration is involved, whether it's at the whole organ level, like tissue engineering, or whether it's at the cellular level, like stem cell therapy, or whether it's at the molecular level, repairing the internal structure of cells, or repairing the structures outside cells, the extracellular structures that hold our organs together. And it turns out that all of those things are important when it comes to applying regenerative medicine to aging. So now, what is aging? There are loads and loads of definitions of aging out there, loads and loads. And most of them are actually not very useful. What do I mean by useful? I mean they're not very good at helping us to orient our thoughts with relation to what we should do about aging, how we could actually develop medicine against aging. This definition doesn't have that problem. This definition is really useful in that regard. There are a couple of things in this definition. First of all, it's a mechanistic definition. It says aging is a side effect of being alive in the first place. So, as those of you who are biologists will know, metabolism doesn't just mean oxygen metabolism. It doesn't just mean the rate at which we consume nutrients and the rate at which we consume oxygen. It means all of the processes that keep us alive from one day to the next. Metabolism is simply a word that means the normal operation of the body. Pathology is the word I'm using here to denote all of the things that go wrong with the body in late life. So all of the deficiencies, the disabilities and diseases of old age. So metabolism eventually causes pathology. You knew that. The other thing that this definition says, which is extraordinarily important, and it's something that I think we need to focus on now because it's going to underlie everything else I say now, is we introduce the word damage to explain how metabolism causes pathology. Metabolism causes pathology because throughout life, even starting before we're born, metabolism has these side effects. It makes molecular and cellular changes to the composition of the body, and those molecular and cellular changes accumulate. They progress with time. And the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that accumulation of what I'm calling damage, but only a certain amount. So eventually the amount of damage exceeds that amount, and you get the pathologies of old age. That is a very down-to-earth, straightforward, simple definition of aging, but it's really useful. Here's the first reason why it's useful. It helps us to distinguish between the two major traditional schools of thought that exist in relation to how we might do something about aging. I'm going to call those two things the geriatrics approach and the gerontology approach. Okay, so the geriatrics approach covers pretty much everything we have today in medicine to actually work against aging. It means basically treating the diseases of old age just like any other disease. And we can see pretty easily from the definition of aging that I've given you why the geriatrics approach is such a failure, why we have succeeded so poorly in postponing the diseases of old age using that medical approach. It's simply because it intervenes too late in the chain of events. We are trying to attack the pathologies of old age, but of course, those pathologies are going to get progressively harder and harder to attack because the precursors of those pathologies, i.e. the damage, is continuing to accumulate and to, if you like, impose more and more pressure on the progression of the pathologies. So the geriatrics approach is a downward spiral. It's a losing battle. It's better than nothing, but it's only a little bit better than nothing, and that's how it always will be. Okay, so that's not actually original with me by any means. People have been thinking and saying this for quite a while, albeit perhaps in slightly different language. And that's why the gerontology approach exists. The gerontology approach simply says, well, prevention is better than cure, okay? So maybe we'll actually do better if we try to clean up metabolism and postpone the age at which damage reaches the level that's pathogenic simply by slowing down the rate at which metabolism creates damage. Great idea in principle. Unfortunately, it also has a huge, massive hole, which is this. Metabolism is rather complicated. So the biologists in the audience will recognize that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how biology actually works, how metabolism works. Bad enough. Pretty hairy, very tricky to tweak this thing so as to have some improvement without, at the same time, having unintended consequences that do more harm than good. Of course, the real problem is much worse. The real problem is that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works, which is completely dwarfed by the astronomical amount that we don't know about how metabolism works, even ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So, it's not doomed in principle, the gerontology approach, but it is an idea whose time has emphatically not come. It's just not going to work. Okay, but if that were the end of my story, I wouldn't be standing here, so what's the rest of the story? Well, of course, the rest of the story is that we have a third way. And in order to introduce that, let me briefly talk about cars. Because, let's face it, the human body is a machine. It's a really complicated machine, but it's still a machine, which means that we might be able to learn a bit about how to extend the healthy, functioning lifespan of the machine that we call the human body by looking at how we already successfully extend the healthy lifespan of simple man-made machines. So this machine here is more than 50 years old, and that's a lot longer than your average car lasts. As you know, most cars will fall apart maybe after 15 years. And this car's doing fine. But the reason it's doing fine is because it was built that way. So that's very much the same reason why the human body lasts so much longer than the body of a dog or a mouse. We just got better, more sophisticated, inbuilt anti-aging machinery than they have. But here is a different car built in the same year as the previous slide, the other one on the previous slide. And it's also doing fine, despite the fact that it was not built to last. It's doing well because, for whatever reason, its owners fell in love with it and they did a lot of maintenance on it, and a greater amount of maintenance than the law requires. And that worked. It kept this car going way beyond its warranty period. So if we now go back and say, well, what would this mean for the human body? This is what it means. There's a third way. Well, I'm going to call it the maintenance approach. It's all about not slowing down the processes by which metabolism causes damage or damage causes pathology, but rather separating those processes from each other by periodically going in and repairing this damage so that it never reaches the level of abundance that's pathogenic. So clearly that, first of all, avoids the problem of the geriatrics approach because we're here not addressing something that has accumulating precursors and therefore we don't have the downward spiral issue. But also, we avoid the problem of the gerontology approach because here we're proposing to let metabolism create damage at the natural rate. And therefore we don't have the problem of having to interfere in metabolism into this enormously complicated process that we don't understand. That's one reason why the maintenance approach is so good. But there's another one, which is this. It turns out that damage is not actually all that complicated as compared to metabolism or pathology. all of the phenomena that can qualify as damage by the definition I'm using, these intermediates between metabolism and pathology, can actually be classified into just these 7 major categories. And as you can see, these categories are really straightforward, down-to-earth, real biological phenomena. Cell loss, that means cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. Cells dividing too often and therefore becoming too abundant. Cells not dying when they're supposed to and therefore in that way becoming too abundant. Various types of molecular change inside the cell, various molecular changes outside the cell. It's a pretty strong statement that should really be an exhaustive classification of the damage of aging, but there's quite a lot of reason to believe it's true. First of all, we can just look at what we're made of. Clearly, damage can only accumulate in long-lived structures, because if a damaged structure is destroyed and removed, then the damage is removed. So we can just say, well, we're made of cells and stuff between cells, and we can say what are cells made of, and you get pretty much this list that way. Another way, which is a bit more circumstantial but also quite compelling, is to ask how long ago it was since we added to this list. And it turns out to be about 30 years, which is a long time in science. So that's pretty good news. But here's the really good news. Not only can we describe the problem in these rather useful terms by splitting it into these 7 sub-problems, but also we can describe in a lot of detail how to actually repair each of these types of damage. I've just written the list on the right-hand side of this table, but a few years ago I wrote a book which described all of these things in all the detail that you can possibly imagine, and it turns out that that book has an entire chapter on each of these things. So we know an awful lot about how to move forward with this. Furthermore, we are moving forward really fast. The 2 editions of that book, the hardback edition and the paperback edition, came out a year apart, and we had to write an entire new full-length chapter for the paperback edition just to cover the 12 months of progress that had been made in the intervening time. So that really tells you what's happening here. I've only got 53 seconds left, so I'd better just tell you that this book is obviously available on Amazon and so on, and I do encourage you to get it. It's written for the non-specialist. In other words, no technical jargon is required, so to speak. But on the other hand, it is quite hard work because it's very detailed. I assure you that those biologists in the audience will not feel that they have been shortchanged in terms of cutting corners. So I'm pretty pleased about all this. I can also tell you, if you want a more circumstantial reason to believe that what I'm saying is not complete bullshit, that that even though maybe 6 or 8 years ago I did receive a lot of skepticism from the gerontological community in relation to whether this could actually occur, that skepticism has pretty much faded away at this point. That's the reason why the scientific advisory board of the SENS Foundation consists of 20-odd extremely prestigious scientists covering all the fields in question, and it's also why I get regularly asked to organize entire sessions of gerontology conferences these days, whereas 5 years ago I wouldn't even be invited to speak. So this is becoming mainstream. It's no longer something that is legitimate for any scientist to ridicule, and once one has got some sense of the feasibility of all of this, it becomes a good deal easier to think rationally about the desirability of it. I haven't had time today to speak at all to those of you in the audience who may be thinking, well, hang on, this doesn't seem like a very good idea, even if we could do it. All I've really been able to emphasize here is that this is all about health, and therefore that any longevity benefits that might occur, and as some of you will know, I am somewhat notorious for predicting rather substantial longevity benefits, those longevity benefits will be a side effect of the health benefits. And that is a critical thing to remember for any of you who are somewhat ambivalent about the idea of living a long time, but not so ambivalent about getting Alzheimer's disease. So I'll stop there, except I'll just mention that we're a charity. Any billionaires in the audience can see me later. But also I want to emphasize that we don't just need money, we also absolutely need people's time. Any biologists in the audience, please think about how you might work in areas that are relevant to all of this. Any, journalists, any conference organizers, obviously how you can help promote this work. Everything matters. Everyone can do advocacy, explain to your friends, your colleagues, your family why this is important. And of course we have a website and I have an email address, and we are always very happy to hear from you. Thank you very much.